Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 6, the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, from an exposition of the mysteries or religious dogmas and customs of the ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans and Druids, also an inquiry into the origin, history and purport of Freemasonry, by John Fellows. Chapter 4, the Metamorphosis of Apuleius and the amour of Cupid and Psyche. Thus far concerning the use of the mysteries to society. How essential they were esteemed to religion we may understand by the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, a book indeed which from its very first appearance hath passed for a trivial fable. Capitolinus, in the life of Clodius Albinus, where he speaks of that kind of tales which disconcert the gravity of philosophers, tells us that Severus could not bear with patience the honours the Senate had conferred on Albinus, especially their distinguishing him with the title of learned, who was grown old in the study of old wives' fables, such as the Milesian-Punic tales of his countryman, and favourite, Apuleius. The writer of the Metamorphosis, however, was one of the gravest and most virtuous as well as most learned philosophers of his age. Albinus appears to have gone further into the true character of this work than his rival Severus. And if we may believe Marcus Aurelius, who calls Albinus a man of experience, of demure life and grave morals, he was not a man to be taken with such trifling amusements as Milesian fables. His fondness, therefore, for the Metamorphosis of Apuleius shows that he considered it in another light. And who so likely to be let into the author's true design as Albinus, who lived very near his time and was of Adrumetum in the neighbourhood of Carthage, where Apuleius sojourned and studied and was distinguished with public honours. The work is indeed of a different character from what some ancients have represented it, and even from what modern critics have pretended to discover of it. Those ancients who stuck in the outside considered it, without refinement, as an idle fable. The moderns, who could not reconcile a work of that nature to the gravity of the author's character, have supposed it a thing of more importance, and no less than a general satire on the vices of those times. But this is far short of the matter. The author's main purpose was not to satirize the specific vices of his age, though to enliven his fable and for the better carrying on his story he hath employed many circumstances of this kind, but to recommend pagan religion as the only cure for all vices whatsoever. To give what we have to say its proper force, we must consider the real character of the writer. Apuleius of Madura in Africa was a devoted Platonist, and like the Platonists of that age, an inveterate enemy to Christianity. His zeal for the honour of philosophy is seen in that solemn affirmation when convened before a court of justice: "I have never derogated aught from the honour of philosophy which is more precious to me than life." His superstitious attachment to the religion of his country is seen in his immoderate fondness for the mysteries. He was initiated, as he tells us, into almost all of them, and in some bore the most distinguished offices. In his apology before the proconsul of Africa, he says, "Will you have me relate what kind of things those were which, wrapped up in a napkin, I confided to the house of Pontianus? You shall be allowed. I have been initiated in Greece into many mysteries. I carefully guard certain of their signs and tokens which have been committed to me by the priests. I say nothing unusual, nothing unknown. Ye who are present know what thing it is of Father Bacchus Simistar, which you keep concealed at home, and silently venerate, apart from the profane. But I, as I have said, through love of truth and duty to the gods, have learnt numerous mysteries, and very many rites and various ceremonies. Nor do I make up this for the occasion, but it is about 3 years ago that, shortly after my arrival at Oea, in a public discourse on the majesty of Aesculapius, I made some declaration and enumerated whatever mysteries I knew. That discourse is very celebrated, is generally read, is in the hands of everybody, commended to the pious people of Oea, not so much by my eloquence as by the mention of Aesculapius. Can it then appear strange to anybody who has any knowledge of religion that a man versed in so many mysteries of the gods should keep certain holy rites in his house? I'm accustomed, wherever I go, to take with me the image of some god packed up among my books, and on festivals to worship it with incense and wine, and sometimes with sacrifices. His great devotion to paganism, therefore, must needs have been attended with an equal aversion to Christianity, and it is more than probable that the oration he speaks of as made in honour of Aesculapius was in the number of those invectives at that time so well received by the enemies of our holy faith. For not to insist on the success of his oration, which he tells us was in everybody's hands, a thing common to discourses on subjects that engage the public attention, but rarely the fortune of such stale ware as panegyrics on a god long worn into an establishment. Not, I say, to insist upon this, we may observe that Aesculapius was one of those ancient heroes who were employed by the defenders of paganism to oppose Jesus. And the circumstances of Aesculapius's story made him the fittest of any in fabulous antiquity for that purpose. Having seen what there was in the common passion of his sect, and in his own fond mode of superstition to indispose Apuleius to Christianity, let us inquire what private provocation he might have to prejudice him against it. For a private provocation, I am persuaded he had, occasioned by a personal injury done him by one of this profession, which I suppose did not a little contribute to exasperate his bigotry. He had married a rich widow, against the will of her first husband's relations, who endeavored to set aside the marriage on pretense of his employing sorcery and enchantments to engage her affections. Of this he was judicially accused by his wife's brother-in-law, Licinius Aemilianus, before the proconsul of Africa. Now his accuser, if I'm not much mistaken, was a Christian, though this interesting circumstance hath escaped his commentators. Now, irreligion and atheism, we know, was the name Christianity at that time went by, for having dared to renounce the whole family of the Gentile gods in a lump. Aemilianus had made such clear work that there was not so much as an anointed stone, or a tree adorned with consecrated garlands, to be found throughout his whole farm. That the atheism of Aemilianus was of this sort, and no courtly or philosophic impiety appears from his character and station. He was neither a fine gentleman nor a profound inquirer into nature. Characters indeed which are sometimes found to be above religion, but are more rustic in his life and manners. Now plain unpolished men in such a station are never without some religion or other. When we find Aemilianus, therefore, not of the established, we must needs conclude him to be a sectary and a Christian. His neglect of his country gods was not a mere negative affront of forgetfulness. He gloried in being their despiser, and took kindly to the name of Mezentius as a title of honor. Alterum, quod libentius audit, ob deorum contemptum, Mezentius, which I would consider as a further mark of a Christian convict. He even held it an abomination so much as to put his hand to his lips, according to the mode of adoration in those times. When he passed by a heathen temple, nefas habet adorandi gratia manum labris ad movere, the most characteristic mark of a primitive confessor, by which he could never be mistaken, nor, one would think, so long overlooked. The aversion, therefore, which Apuleius had contracted to his Christian accuser, and we see by his apology it was in no ordinary degree, would without doubt increase his prejudice to that religion. I am persuaded he gave the character of the baker's wife in his golden ass for no other reason than to outrage our holy faith. He draws her stained with all the vices that could fall to the share of a woman, and then, to finish all, he makes her a Christian. Let us see now how this would influence his writings. There was nothing the philosophers of that time had more at heart, especially the Platonists and Pythagoreans, than the support of sinking paganism. This service, as hath been occasionally remarked, they performed in various ways and manners, some by allegorizing their theology, some by spiritualizing their philosophy, and some, as Jamblichus and Philostratus, by writing the lives of their heroes to oppose to that of Christ. Others again, as Porphyry, with this view, collected their oracles, or as Melanthius, Menander, Hicesius, and Sotades wrote descriptive encomiums on their mysteries, which last, as we shall now show, was the province undertaken by Apuleius, his Metamorphosis being nothing else but one continued recommendation of them. But let us inquire into the motives our author might have for entering at all into the defense of paganism. His reasons for choosing this topic of defense, the recommendation of the mysteries. As to his defense of paganism in general, we may observe that works of this kind were very much in fashion, especially amongst the philosophers of our author's sect. He was, as we have seen, most superstitiously devoted to pagan worship, and he bore a personal spite and prejudice to the Christian profession. As to his making the defense of the mysteries his choice, still stronger reasons may be assigned. These were the rites to which he was so peculiarly devoted that he had contrived to be initiated into all the mysteries of note in the Roman world, and in several of them had borne the most distinguished offices. The mysteries being at this time become extremely corrupt and consequently in discredit, needed an able and zealous apologist, both of which qualities met eminently in Apuleius. The corruptions were of two kinds, debaucheries and magic. Their debaucheries we have taken notice of above, their magic will be considered hereafter. But our author's close attachment to mysterious rites was, without question, the very thing that occasioned all those suspicions and reports which ended in an accusation of magic. And considering what hath been said of the corrupt state of the mysteries, the reader will not wonder at it. Such then being the general character of the mysteries and of their great devotee, nothing was more natural than his projecting their defense, which at the same time that it concurred to the support of paganism in general, would vindicate his own credit, together with an institution of which he was so immoderately fond. And the following considerations are sufficient to show that the Metamorphosis was written after his apology, for his accusers never once mentioned the fable of the golden ass to support their charge of magic, though they were in great want of proofs, and this lay so ready for their purpose. He positively asserts before the tribunal of Maximus Clodius that he had never given the least occasion to suspect him of magic, nusquam passus sum vel exiguam suspicionem magiae consistere. Now antiquity considered initiation into the mysteries as a delivery from a living death of vice, brutality and misery, and the beginning of a new life of virtue, reason and happiness. This therefore was the very circumstance which our author chose for the subject of his recommendation. And as in the mysteries their moral and divine truths were represented in shows and allegories, so in order to comply with this method of instruction, and in imitation of the ancient masters of wisdom who borrowed their manner of teaching from thence, he hath artfully insinuated his doctrine in an agreeable fable, and the fittest one could conceive for his purpose, as will be seen when we come to examine it. The foundation of this allegory was a Milesian fable, a species of polite trifling then much in vogue, and not very unlike the modern Arabian tales. To allure his readers, therefore, with the promise of a fashionable work, he introduces his Metamorphosis in this manner. And I too will deliver to you various fables in this Milesian style, and delight your ears in a gentle whisper, plainly intimating that there was something of more consequence at bottom. But they took him at his word, and never troubled their heads about a further meaning. The outside engaged all their attention, and sufficiently delighted them, as we may gather from the early title it bore of Asinus Aureus, unless we will rather suppose it to have been bestowed by the few intelligent readers in the secret, for in spite of the author, a secret it was, and so all along continued. From the beginning of Pliny's epistles, I suspect that Aurea was the common title given to the Milesian, and such like tales as strollers used to tell for a piece of money to the rabble in a circle. Pliny's words are these: upon one of these popular fables he chose to engraft his instruction, taking a celebrated tale from the collections of one Lucius of Patten, who relates his transformation into an ass and his adventures under that shape. Lucian has epitomized this story, as Apuleius seems to have paraphrased it. And the subject being a metamorphosis, it admirably fitted his purpose, as the metempsychosis to which that superstition belongs was one of the fundamental doctrines of the mysteries. The fable opens with the representation of a young man personated by himself, sensible of the advantages of virtue and piety, but immoderately fond of pleasure and as curious of magic. He gives loose to his vicious appetite, and the crimes and follies into which they lead him soon end in his transformation to a brute. This contrivance of the introductory part is artful and finally insinuates the great moral of the piece, that brutality attends vice as its punishment, and punishment by actual transformation was keeping up to the popular opinion. St. Austin permitted himself to doubt whether Apuleius's account of his change into an ass was not a true relation. I shall say nothing to this extravagant doubt, but only observe that it appears from hence that St. Austin esteemed Apuleius a prodigal in his manners and addicted to the superstitions of magic, but to proceed with his plan. Having now shown himself thoroughly brutalized by his crimes, He goes on to represent at large the miseries of that condition in a long detail of his misadventures, in the course of which he fell by turns under the dominion of every vicious passion, though the incidents are chiefly confined to the mischiefs of unlawful love, and this with much judgment, as one of the principal ends of the mysteries was to curb and subdue this inordinance, which brings more general and lasting misery upon mankind than all the others. And as it was the great moral of his piece to show that pure religion, such as a Platonic philosopher esteemed pure, was the only remedy for human corruption. So, to prevent the abuse or mistake of this capital principle, he takes care to inform us that an attachment to superstitious and corrupt religion does but plunge the wretched victim into still greater miseries. This he finely illustrates in the history of his adventures with the begging priests of Cybele, whose enormities are related in the 8th and 9th books, and whose corrupt mysteries are intended as a contrast to the pure rites of Isis, with which in a very studied description and encomium he concludes the fable. In the meantime, matters growing from bad to worse, and Lucius plunged deeper and deeper in the sink of vice, his affairs come to a crisis. For this is one great beauty in the conduct of the fable, that every change of station, while he remains a brute, makes his condition still more wretched and deplorable. And being now about to perpetrate one of the most shocking enormities, nature, though so deeply brutalized, revolts. He abhors the idea of his projected crime. He evades his keepers. He flies to the seashore, and in this solitude begins to reflect more seriously on his lost condition. This is finely imagined, for we often see men, even after a whole life of horrors, come suddenly to themselves on the hideous aspect of some monster vice too frightful even for a hardened conscience to endure. Nor is it with less judgment that the author makes these beginnings of reformation confirmed by solitude, when the unhappy victim of pleasure hath broken loose from the companions and partakers of his follies, and now a more intimate acquaintance of his hopeless state obliges him to fly to heaven for relief. The moon is in full splendor, and the awful silence of the night inspires him with sentiments of religion. He then purifies himself in the manner prescribed by Pythagoras, the philosopher most addicted to initiations of all the early sages, as Apuleius of all the later, and so makes his prayer to the moon or Isis, invoking her by her several names of the Eleusinian series, the celestial Venus, Diana, and Proserpine. When betaking himself to repose, she appears to him in a dream under that shining image so much spoken of by the mystics, as representing the divine nature in general. Artemidorus says that for a man to dream that Ceres, Proserpine, or Bacchus appears to him betokens some extraordinary good fortune to happen to him. This popular divination by dreams was apparently founded on the common opinion of the advantages attending initiation into the mysteries. The ancient honora critics were not founded on the arbitrary fancies of the impostors who professed that art, but on the customs and superstitions of the times, and with a principal reference to the Egyptian hieroglyphics and mysteries. These several symbolic attributes, as described by Apuleius, but here omitted, the lucid round, the snakes, the ears of corn, and the sistrum, represent the tutelar deities of the Hecatman, Bacchic, Eleusinian, and Isiac mysteries. That is, the mystic rites in general, for whose sake the allegory was invented, as the black palla in which she is wrapped, embroidered with a silver moon and stars, denotes the time in which the mysteries were celebrated, namely in the dead of night, which was so constant and inseparable a circumstance that the author calls initiation noctis societas. Masonic meetings are nocturnal, and the aprons of the fraternity are generally ornamented with figures of the sun, moon, and 7 stars or planets, which shows that the principal design of the institution was something very different from the mechanical occupation of Masonry. They show indeed that it was founded on Sabaeism, the worship of the stars. Behold, Lucius, I, moved by thy prayers, am present with thee. I, who am nature, the parent of things, the queen of all the elements, the primordial progeny of ages, the supreme of divinities, the sovereign of the spirits of the dead, the first of the celestials, and the uniform resemblance of gods and goddesses. I who rule by my nod the luminous summits of the heavens, the salubrious breezes of the sea, and the deplorable silences of the realms beneath, and whose one divinity the whole orb of the earth venerates under a manifold form by different rites and a variety of appellations. Hence the primogenial Phrygians call me Pessinuntica, the mother of the gods, the Attic Aborigines, Cecropian Minerva, the floating Cyprians, Paphian Venus, the arrow-bearing Cretans, Diana Dictina, the three-tongued Sicilians, Stygian Proserpine, and the Eleusinians, the ancient goddess Ceres. Some also call me Juno, others Bellona, others Hecate, and others Rhamnusia, and those who are illuminated by the incipient rays of that divinity, the sun when he rises, viz. The Ethiopians, the Arii, and Egyptians skilled in ancient learning, worshipping me by ceremonies perfectly appropriate, call me by my true name, Queen Isis. This was exactly adapted to the design of the mysteries and preparatory to the communication of the Aporeta. It had likewise this further use to patch up and recommend the pagan religions by showing that their polytheism consisted in nothing else than in giving the supreme God various names, merely expressive of his various attributes. This was the fashionable coloring which, after the appearance of Christianity, the advocates of paganism employed to blanch their idolatry. I will only observe further that the words, the Egyptians worshipping me with ceremonies perfectly appropriate, insinuate what was true, that all mysterious worship came first from Egypt, this people having penetrated furthest into the nature of the gods. As the calling her who represents the mysteries in general, rerum natura parens, shows plainly what were the Aporeta of them all. Parent nature then reveals to Lucius the means of his recovery. Her festival was on the following day, when there was to be a procession of her votaries. The priest who led it up would have a chaplet of roses in his hand, which had the virtue to restore him to his former shape. But as breaking through a habit of vice is of all things the most difficult, she adds encouragements to her promises, nor should you fear anything pertaining to my concerns as difficult. For in this very same moment of time in which I come to you, being there also present, I order my priest in a dream to do those things which are to be done hereafter. Alluding to what was taught in the mysteries, that the assistance of heaven was always present to second the efforts of virtue. But in return for the favor of releasing him from his brutal shape, that is, of reforming his manners by initiation, she tells him she expected the service of his whole life, and this the mysteries required. Nor should his service go unrewarded, for he should have a place in Elysium hereafter, and this too the mysteries promised. Lucius is at length confirmed in his resolution of aspiring to a life of virtue. And on this change of his dispositions and entire conquest of his passions, the author finally represents all nature as putting on a new face of cheerfulness and gaiety. All things likewise, independent of my peculiar joy, seem to me to exult with such great hilarity that I might have thought that cattle of every kind, every house, and even the day itself rejoiced with a serene countenance. And to enjoy nature, in these her best conditions, was the boasted privilege of the initiated, as we may see from a chorus in the Frogs of Aristophanes. And now the procession in honor of Isis begins, where, by the way, we must observe that the 2 first days of the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries are plainly described. The one called Agermos, from the multitude assembled; the other, Alasse Mistai, from the procession made to the seashore. Then there was an influx of a crowd of those who had been initiated in the sacred rites of the goddess, resplendent with the pure whiteness of linen garments. In the next place, the images of the gods, carried by the priests of Isis, proceeded, not disdaining to walk with the feet of men, this terrifyingly raising a canine head, but that being the messenger of the infernal gods and of those in the realms beneath, with an erect face, partly black and partly of a golden color, bearing in his left hand a caduceus and shaking in his right hand branches of the flourishing palm tree, whose footsteps a crow in an erect position immediately followed. This crow was the prolific resemblance of the all-parent goddess, and was carried on the shoulders of one of the blessed servants of this divinity, and who acted the part of a mimic as he walked. Another carried a cister or chest containing arcane and perfectly concealing the mystic symbols of a magnificent religion, and another bore in his happy bosom the venerable effigies of the supreme divinity, which was not similar to any cattle, bird, or wild beast, nor even to man, but being venerable for the subtlety by which it was invented and also for its novelty, was an ineffable indication of a more sublime religion, and which was to be concealed with the greatest silence. I've given a more full account of this procession from the work of Apuleius than is copied by Warburton. In the processions of the London Masons before noticed at laying the foundation stone and the dedication of Freemasons' Hall in 1775 and 1776, among other things, were carried 3 pitchers containing corn, wine and oil, the Bible, a canty or caduceus, a cister or chest, here called the lodge, etc. After the ceremony of laying the foundation stone, the brethren proceeded through the city in procession without exposing any of the insignia of the order. The priest or hierophant of the rites leads up the train of the initiated with a garland of roses in his hand. Lucius approaches, devours the roses, and is, according to the promise of the goddess, restored to his natural form, by which, as we have said, no more was meant than a change of manners from vice to virtue, and this the author plainly intimates by making the goddess thus address him under his brutal form: "Immediately divest yourself of the hide of that worst of beasts, and which for some time since has been to me detestable." For an ass was so far from being detestable that it was employed in the celebration of her rites and was ever found in the retinue of Osiris or Bacchus. The garland plainly represents that which the aspirants were crowned with at their initiation, just as the virtue of the roses designates the mysteries. At his transformation he had been told that roses were to restore him to humanity, so that amidst all his adventures he had still this remedy in view. The modern Masonic degree of Rose-Cross seems to allude to this ridiculous conceit regarding the virtue of roses. The following dialogue takes place between the master and senior warden. "Do you know the pelican?" "I do." "What does it signify?" "Among us it is a symbol of the Saviour of the world and of his perfect humanity." "What is the object of the degree of Knights of the Rose-Cross?" "To lead us to respect the decrees of the Most High, who is able to reinstamp his image on us." To reinstamp is here intended to signify the restoration to a former state, which is exactly what occurred to Lucius when in his asinine condition by the eating of roses. The pelican is a Roman Catholic symbol of the Saviour, arising from the fable that this bird perforates its breast and suffers its young to feed upon the blood issuing therefrom. The Saviour, in the ritual of the Catholic Church, is thus addressed: "Pelican Jesus, cleanse us with thy blood, one drop of which is sufficient to purify a world." The degree of Rose-Cross was invented in France, a Roman Catholic country. Our author proceeds to tell us that the people wondered at this instantaneous metamorphosis. The people admire and the religious venerate so evident an indication of the power of the supreme divinity and the magnificence and facility of my restoration. For the mysteries boasted the power of giving a sudden and entire change to the mind and affections, and the advocates of paganism against Christianity used to oppose this boast to the real and miraculous efficacy of grace. As soon as Lucius had recovered the integrity of his nature by initiation, the priest covers him, naked as he was, with a linen garment. A habit always bestowed upon the aspirant on his admission to the mysteries, the rationale of which Apuleius himself gives us in his Apology. Wool, the excretion of the most sluggish body belonging to the herd, was for that reason pronounced by Orpheus and Pythagoras to be a profane garment. But flax, truly the most cleanly of the best productions of the earth, not only clothed and veiled the most holy priests of Egypt, but was used also to cover the sacred utensils. Apuleius, page 64. When all was over, the priest accosts his penitent in the following manner: "O Lucius, you have at length arrived at the port of quiet, and the altar of pity, having endured many and various labors and great tempests of fortune, and been tossed about by mighty waves of calamity. Assume now a more joyful countenance, and more adapted to that white garment which you wear. Attend the pomp of your Saviour Goddess with triumphant steps. Let the irreligious see, let them see and acknowledge their error. Behold Lucius rejoicing in the providence of the great Isis, and freed from his pristine miseries, triumphs in his own fortune." Whilst the apron with which we, Masons, are clothed indicates a disposition of innocence and belies not the wearer's heart, let the ignorant deride and scoff on. Superior to the ridicule and malice of the wicked, we will enfold ourselves in the garb of our own virtue, and safe in our self-approving conscience, stand unmoved against the persecutions of adversity. The raiment which truly implies the innocence of the heart is a badge more honourable than ever was devised by kings. The Roman eagle with all the orders of knighthood are thereunto inferior. Smith. Formerly, Masons used to be clothed in white during lodge hours, which practice is still followed in many lodges in Germany, France and Holland, but in England, the white apron only is remaining. Here, the moral of the fable is delivered in plain terms. And in this moral, all we have advanced concerning the purpose of the work, fully confirmed. It is expressly declared that vice and inordinate curiosity were the causes of Lucius's disasters, from which the only relief was initiation into the mysteries, whereby the author would insinuate that nothing was more abhorrent from those holy rites than debauchery and magic, the two enormities they were then commonly suspected to encourage. It hath been observed above that by Lucius's return to his proper form was meant his initiation, and accordingly that return is called, as initiation was, the being born again, ut renatus quodmodo and sua providentia quodmodo renatos. But this was only to the lesser, not the greater mysteries. The first was to purify the mind, hence it was called by the ancients kakias abairasin, a separation from evil. The second was to enlighten it when purified and to bring it to the knowledge of divine secrets. Hence they named the one katharsin and the other teleothta, purification and perfection. The Masonic degree of perfection, or the grand elect, perfect and sublime Mason, it may be presumed, is entitled to the appellation of teleothia. The first is here represented in the incident of Lucius's being restored to humanity by the use of roses. The second, as the matter of chief importance, the author treats more circumstantially. He begins with making the priest take occasion from the benefit already received to press Lucius to enter into the greater mysteries of Isis, but at the same time makes him inform the candidate that nothing was to be precipitated, for that not only many previous rites and ceremonies concerning religious diet and abstinence from profane food were to be observed, but that the aspirants to these higher mysteries were to wait for a call. The author, by the doubts and apprehensions which retarded his initiation, first gives us to understand that the highest degree of sanctity was required of those who entered into the mysteries. These difficulties being surmounted, he is initiated with the accustomed ceremonies. He then makes his prayer, in which the grand apparator of the mysteries is still more plainly referred to. Thou, O holy and perpetual Saviour of the human race, being always munificent in cherishing mortals, dost employ the sweet affection of a mother in the misfortunes of the miserable. Nor is there any day or night or even a slender moment of time which passes unattended by thy benevolent interpositions. Thou protectest men both by sea and land, and dispersing the storms of life, dost extend thy salutary right hand, by which thou drawest back the inextricably twisted thread of the fates, and dost mitigate the tempests of inclement fortune, and restrain the noxious courses of the stars. The supernal gods reverence thee, and those in the realms beneath attentively observe thy nod. Thou rollest the sphere of the universe round the steady poles, dost illuminate the sun, govern the world, and tread on the dark realms of Tartarus. The stars move responsive to thy command, the gods rejoice in thy majesty, the hours and seasons return by thy appointment, and the elements reverence thy decree. Respondent Sidera. This, I suppose, relates to the music of the spheres. The image is noble and sublime. It is taken from the consent in one lyre to answer to and obey the hand of the master who had put them into tune. By thy nod blasts of wind blow, the clouds are nourished, seeds germinate and blossoms increase. Birds swiftly pass through the tracks of the air, wild beasts wandering on the mountains, serpents concealed in the ground, and the enormous monsters that swim in the sea are terrified at the majesty which invests thy divinity, etc. The affair thus over, the author in the next place takes occasion, agreeably to his real practice and opinions, to recommend a multiplicity of initiations. He tells us how Isis counseled him to enter into the mysteries of Osiris, how after that she invited him to a third initiation and then rewarded him for his accumulated piety with an abundance of temporal blessings. All this considered, we can no longer doubt but that the true design of his work was to recommend initiation into the mysteries in opposition to the new religion. We see the catastrophe of the piece, the whole 11th book entirely taken up with it, and composed with the greatest seriousness and superstition. And surely nothing could be better conceived to recommend the mysteries than the idea of such a plan, or better contrived than his execution of it, in which he omits no circumstance that might be plausibly opposed to Christianity, or that might be recommended with advantage to the magistrate's favor, as where he tells us that in these rites they prayed for the prosperity of all orders in the state, for the great emperor, the senate, the equestrian order, and for all the Roman people. This interpretation will throw new light on every part of the Golden Ass, but I have been so long upon the subject that I have only time to give one instance, and this chiefly because it reflects it back again on the general interpretation of the fable, the amour of Cupid and Psyche. In the 5th and 6th books is the long episode of Cupid and Psyche, visibly allegorical throughout, and entirely foreign to all the rest of the work, considered as a more Milesian fable, but very applicable to the writer's purpose, if he had that moral to inculcate which we have here assigned him. In order to a due understanding of the fable, it is necessary to know the nature of the characters upon which it is founded. Psyche, Greek, the soul or life, a goddess, by which the ancients seem to mean the human soul. She was represented with the wings of a butterfly on her shoulders to signify by the nimbleness of that creature, the activity, nature, and properties of the soul, Bailey. According to ancient mythology, there were two Cupids, one born of Venus and begotten by Jupiter, the inciter of celestial love, the other, the son of Erebus and Nox, the author of terrestrial amours. There was no man, though he regarded the golden ass as a thing of mere amusement, but saw that the story of Cupid and Psyche was a philosophic allegory of the progress of the soul to perfection in the possession of divine love and the reward of immortality. The amour of Cupid and Psyche was a subject which lay in common amongst the Platonic writers, and everyone fashioned this agreeable fiction according to the doctrines he had to convey under it. By this means it could not become famous. The remaining monuments of ancient sculpture convince us that it was very famous, in which nothing is so common as the figures of Cupid and Psyche and the various circumstances of their adventures. Now we have shown at large that the professed end of the mysteries was to restore the soul to its original rectitude and to encourage good men with the promises of happiness in another life. The fable, therefore, of Cupid and Psyche in the 5th and 6th books was the finest and most artful preparative for the subject of the 11th, which treats of the mysteries. But if we look more nearly into this beautiful fable, we shall find that besides its general purpose, it has one more particular. We have observed that the corrupt state of the mysteries in the time of Apuleius was one principal reason of his undertaking their apology. These corruptions were of two kinds, debaucheries and magic. Their debaucheries have been taken notice of above. Their magic was of three sorts: the magic of invocation or necromancy, the magic of transformation or metamorphosis, and the magic of divine communication under a visible appearance or theology. The shows of the mysteries seem to have given birth to the first, the doctrine of the metempsychosis taught therein to the second, and the appareta concerning the divine nature to the third. The abomination of the two first sorts was seen by all, and frankly given up as criminal, but the fanatic Platonists and Pythagoreans of the latter ages, espousing the third, occasioned it to be held in credit and reverence. So that, as Heliodorus tells us, the Egyptian priests, between whose philosophy and fanatic Platonism there was at this time a kind of coalition, affected to distinguish between the magic of necromancy and the magic of the elegy, accounting the first infamous and wicked, but the last very fair and even commendable. For now both those fanatics had their philosophic mysteries, the rites of which consisted in the practice of this, the elegic magic. These were the mysteries, to observe it by the way, of which the Emperor Julian was so fond that he placed his principal felicity, as the Christians did his principal crime, in their celebration. But our author, who had imbibed his Platonism not at the muddy streams of those late enthusiasts, but at the pure fountainhead of the academy itself, well understood how much this superstition with all its plausible pretenses had polluted the mysteries, and therefore, as in the course of the adventures of his golden ass, he had stigmatized the two other kinds of magic. He composed this celebrated tale, hitherto so little understood, to expose the magic of theurgy. It is, as we said, a philosophic allegory, delivered in the adventures of Psyche, or the soul, whose various labors and traverses in this progress are all represented as the effects of her indiscreet passion for that species of magic called theurgy. To understand this, we must observe that the enthusiastic Platonists, in their pursuit of the supreme good, the union with the deity, made the completion and perfection of it to consist in the theurgic vision of the autopton agalma, or the self-seen image, that is, seen by the splendor of its own light. Now, the story tells us there were three sisters, the youngest of whom was called Psyche, by which we are to understand the three peripatetic souls, the sensitive, the animal, and the rational, or in other words, sense, appetite, and reason. That the beauty of Psyche was so divine that men forsook the altars of the gods to follow and worship her, according to the ancient aphorism, nullum numen abest, si sit prudentia. No deity is wanting if prudence is consulted. She is contracted to and possesses the celestial Cupid, or divine love, invisibly. In the meantime, her sisters, envious of her superior enjoyments, take advantage of the god's invisibility to perplex her with 1,000 doubts and scruples, which end in exciting her curiosity to get a sight of her lover, by which the author seems to insinuate that they are the irregular passions and appetites which stir up men's curiosity to this species of magic, the theurgic vision. Psyche is deluded by them, and against the express injunction of the god, who calls it sacrilega curiositas, attempts this forbidden sight. She succeeds and is undone. Divine love forsakes her. The scenes of pleasure vanish, and she finds herself forlorn and abandoned, surrounded by miseries and pursued with the vengeance of heaven. In this distress she comes to the temples of Ceres and Juno, and seeks protection of those deities, by which is meant the having recourse to their mysteries against the evils and disasters of life, as is plainly marked by the reason given for her application. Not willing to omit any even doubtful means of bettering my condition. They both deny admittance to her, intimating that the purer mysteries discouraged all kind of magic, even the most specious. In a word, after a long and severe repentance and penance, in which the author seems to have shadowed the trials and labors undergone by the aspirants to the mysteries, she is pardoned and restored to the favor of heaven. She is put again into possession of divine love and rewarded with the prerogative of immortality. There are many other circumstances in this fine allegory equally serving to the end here explained, as there are others which allude to diverse beautiful Platonic notions foreign to the present discourse. It is enough that we have pointed to its chief and peculiar purpose, which it was impossible to see while the nature and design of the whole fable lay undiscovered. Before I totally dismiss this matter, it may not be improper to observe that both Virgil and Apuleius have represented the genuine mysteries as rites of perfect sanctity and purity, and recommended only such to their countrymen, while they expose impure and impious rites to the public aversion. For it was their purpose to stigmatize the reigning corruptions and to recommend the ancient sanctity. On the contrary, a man attached by his office to the recommendation of the mysteries, as then practiced, was to do the best he could, when deprived of the benefit of this distinction, and was to endeavor to give fair colors to the foulest things. This was the case of Jamblichus. His friend Porphyry had some scruples on this head. He doubts whether those rites could come from the gods, which admitted such a mixture of lewdness and impurity. Such a mixture Jamblichus confesses, but at the same time endeavors to account for their divine original by showing that they are only the emblems of natural truths, or a kind of moral purgation of the inordinate passions. Hitherto we have considered the legislator's care in perpetuating the doctrine of a future state. And if I have been longer than ordinary on this head, my excuse is that the topic was new, and the doctrine itself, which is the main subject of the present inquiry, much interested in it. Theurgy. Theurgy is compounded of theos, God, and ergon, work, and signifies magic operating by divine or celestial means, or the power of doing extraordinary and supernatural things by lawful means, as prayer, invocation of God, etc., called by some white magic, Bailey. The wisest of the pagan world and their greatest philosophers held theurgic magic in the highest esteem. Theurgy was, according to them, a divine art which served only to advance the mind of man to the highest perfection and render the soul more pure. And they, who by means of this magic had the happiness to arrive at what they called autopsia, or intuition, a state wherein they enjoyed intimate intercourse with the gods, believed themselves invested with all their power, and were persuaded that nothing to them was impossible. Towards this state of perfection all those aspired who made profession of that sort of magic, but then it laid them under severe regulations. None could be priest of this order, but a man of unblemished morals, and all who joined with him in his operations were bound to strict purity. They were not allowed to have any commerce with women, to eat any kind of animal food, nor to defile themselves by the touch of a dead body. The philosophers and persons of the greatest virtue thought it their honor to be initiated into the mysteries of this sort of magic. Thomas Taylor, in a note to his translation of Jamblicus, observes, "This art of divine works is called theurgy, in which Pythagoras was initiated among the Syrians, as we are informed by Jamblicus in his life of that philosopher. Proclus was also skilled in this art, as may be seen in his life by Marinus. Psellus, in his manuscript treatise on demons, says that magic formed the last part of the amuletic science, in which place by magic he doubtless means that kind of it which is denominated theurgy, and that theurgy was employed by the ancients in their mysteries I have fully proved in my treatise on the Eleusinian and Bacchic mysteries. This theurgy is doubtless the same as the magic of Zoroaster, which Plato in his first Alcibiades says consisted in the worship of the gods. The Emperor Julian alludes to this theurgical art in the following extract from his Arguments against the Christians, preserved by Cyrillus. For the inspiration which arrives to men from the gods is rare and exists but in a few. Nor is it easy for every man to partake of this, nor at every time. It has ceased among the Hebrews, nor is it preserved to the present time among the Egyptians. Spontaneous oracles also are seen to yield to temporal periods. This, however, our philanthropic Lord and Father Jupiter, understanding that we might not be entirely deprived of communion with the gods, has given us observation through sacred arts, by which we have at hand sufficient assistance." Page 343, 347. This art was professed by the early Masons, as appears by an examination of one of the Brotherhood by King Henry VI. It is, as before observed, a fundamental doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. The priests of Egypt, Persia, India, etc., pretended to bind the gods to their idols and to make them descend from heaven at their pleasure. They threatened the sun and moon to reveal the secret mysteries, to shake the heavens, etc. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses, links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.